The fog that November morning hung over Baker Street like a funeral shroud, and I confess that the metaphor seemed particularly apt given the singular case that was about to unfold before us. I had just finished my morning ablutions and was settling down to a breakfast of kippers and toast when Holmes burst through our sitting-room door with that peculiar energy that invariably signaled the arrival of a case of unusual interest. "Watson!" he exclaimed, his grey eyes alight with that familiar fire of intellectual curiosity. "Put aside your breakfast, old fellow. We have a mystery that promises to tax even our combined faculties." I glanced longingly at my half-finished meal, but knew better than to protest. In the 7 years of our partnership, I had learned to recognize the signs of Holmes's excitement, and this morning he fairly vibrated with anticipation. "What manner of case has presented itself?" I inquired, reaching for my coat. "A most extraordinary affair involving death, deception, and, if I am not mistaken, a considerable sum of money. Mrs. Hudson has shown up a gentleman who claims that a corpse has vanished from his establishment." As if summoned by Holmes's words, our landlady appeared at the door, her face bearing that expression of resigned disapproval she wore whenever our visitors proved to be of the more colourful variety. "Mr. Jeremiah Blackwood to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, stepping aside to admit a tall, gaunt figure dressed in the severe black attire of his profession. Mr. Blackwood was perhaps 50 years of age, with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes that spoke of a lifetime spent in the company of the deceased. His hands, I noted, were exceptionally pale and bore the telltale stains of his trade, embalming fluid and cosmetic preparations that no amount of scrubbing could entirely remove. He moved with the measured gait of one accustomed to solemn occasions, yet there was an unmistakable agitation about his manner. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, his voice carrying the hushed tones of the funeral parlour, "I am at my wits' end. In 30 years of conducting the final business of the departed, I have never encountered such a thing." Holmes gestured toward our client's chair with characteristic grace. "Please, Mr. Blackwood, be seated and relate your singular experience. I perceive you are an undertaker of considerable standing. Your establishment is in Whitechapel, is it not?" Our visitor started visibly. "How could you possibly? The clay beneath your fingernails is of a distinctive reddish hue, found only in the graveyards of East London, and the particular style of mourning pin you wear was fashionable among undertakers of that district some 5 years ago. But pray continue with your account." Blackwood settled into his chair, his composure somewhat shaken by Holmes's display of deductive reasoning. "3 days ago I received the mortal remains of one Mr. Cornelius Ashford, a gentleman of advanced years who had succumbed to what his physician described as natural causes, heart failure brought on by his advanced age of 73 years. He paused to extract a handkerchief and dabbed at his perspiring brow despite the November chill. "Mr. Ashford was a man of some means," he continued, "though he lived modestly in Spitalfields. His nephew, Mr. Timothy Ashford, arranged for the funeral and paid my fee in advance, £25, which is substantial for our neighbourhood. The deceased was to lie in state for 3 days before interment at Kensal Green Cemetery." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And the corpse has vanished, you say?" "Completely, Mr. Holmes. Yesterday evening, I locked the chapel as was my custom, ensuring that Mr. Ashford rested peacefully in his coffin. This morning, when I arrived to prepare for the funeral service, the coffin was empty. Not merely empty, you understand. It appeared as though no body had ever occupied it. The satin lining showed no impression, no disturbance whatsoever." "Most intriguing," Holmes murmured. "Were there any signs of forced entry?" "None whatsoever. The doors remained locked, the windows secure. I have examined every inch of the premises. It is as though the body simply evaporated." I found myself leaning forward, caught up in the mystery despite myself. Surely there must be some rational explanation. Bodies do not simply disappear into thin air. "Precisely Watson's point, Watson," Holmes observed. "Yet here we have a trained professional, a man whose livelihood depends upon the secure handling of the deceased, reporting just such an impossibility." He turned back to our client. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, what do you know of the deceased's circumstances? His family, his habits, his financial situation?" The Undertaker's pale features grew even more troubled. "That is where the matter becomes even more peculiar, Mr. Holmes. Mr. Cornelius Ashford was known in the neighborhood as something of a recluse. He lived alone in a modest house on Dorset Street, keeping to himself and venturing out only for essential provisions. Yet upon his death, no fewer than 4 individuals have come forward claiming to be his rightful heir." Holmes's eyebrows rose sharply. 4 claimants? Most unusual for a man without apparent family connections. "Indeed, there is the nephew I mentioned, Mr. Timothy Ashford, who arranged the funeral. Then we have Miss Eugenia Pemberton, who claims to be the deceased's illegitimate daughter from a relationship some 40 years past. There is also Mr. Rupert Blackthorne, a business associate who insists that Mr. Ashford owed him a substantial debt that must be settled from the estate. Finally, there is Mrs. Dorothy Marsh, an elderly woman who declares herself to have been Mr. Ashford's common-law wife for the past 15 years. A veritable constellation of interested parties," Holmes observed dryly. "And what, pray tell, is the extent of Mr. Ashford's estate?" According to his nephew, the old gentleman kept his affairs private, but there are rumors of considerable savings. Some say he had amassed over £1,000 through careful investments and frugal living. Others whisper of valuable items hidden within his modest dwelling. Holmes rose abruptly and began pacing before our fireplace, a sure sign that his remarkable mind was processing the information at tremendous speed. "Mr. Blackwood," he said at length, "I should very much like to examine your premises, but first tell me, have you spoken to the police regarding this matter?" The Undertaker's expression grew pained. "I felt I must report the disappearance naturally. Inspector Bradstreet of the Metropolitan Police visited my establishment yesterday afternoon. He seemed skeptical of my account. He suggested that perhaps I had misremembered the sequence of events, or that the body had been collected by family members without my knowledge." "And your response?" I assured him that no such collection had taken place. The inspector left with the air of a man who suspected either deliberate deception or incipient madness on my part. "I fear my reputation in the neighborhood may suffer greatly if this matter is not resolved." Holmes nodded sympathetically. "Quite understandable. The reputation of a tradesman, particularly one in your delicate profession, is paramount. Very well, Mr. Blackwood. Watson and I shall accompany you to examine the scene. But first—" He fixed our client with that penetrating stare that had unnerved countless individuals over the years. "Is there anything else you have not told us? Any detail, however seemingly insignificant, that might bear upon this matter?" The Undertaker hesitated, and I observed a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or guilt, cross his gaunt features. "There is one thing," he admitted reluctantly. "On the night before the body disappeared, I thought I heard sounds from within the chapel. Footsteps, as though someone was moving about. But when I investigated, I found nothing amiss. I attributed it to the settling of the building or perhaps neighborhood cats. What time was this? Near midnight, I should say. I had been working late on another client when I heard the sounds." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. "Most illuminating. Come, gentlemen, let us examine the scene of this singular disappearance." The journey to Whitechapel took us through the heart of London's East End, where the fog seemed to cling more tenaciously to the narrow streets and grimy buildings. Blackwood's establishment occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building on Commercial Street, its front window tastefully adorned with the implements of his trade: funeral urns, arrangements of artificial flowers, and a discreet placard advertising complete funeral services at reasonable rates. The interior of the chapel was precisely what one might expect of such an establishment. Rows of wooden chairs facing a raised platform where the coffin would normally rest, walls draped in black crepe, and an atmosphere of hushed solemnity. The air carried the faint but unmistakable odor of embalming fluid mixed with the heavier scent of funeral flowers. Holmes immediately set about his examination with that methodical thoroughness that never failed to impress me. He began at the entrance, scrutinizing the lock mechanism with his magnifying glass, then proceeded to examine every inch of the floor, walls, and furnishings. "The lock shows no signs of tampering," he announced. "The mechanism is well maintained, and would require considerable skill to pick without leaving traces. He moved to the raised platform where the coffin rested, a substantial oak construction with brass fittings that spoke of considerable expense. "Interesting," he murmured, running his fingers along the coffin's interior. "Mr. Blackwood, you mentioned that the lining showed no impression of a body having rested here, yet I observe several small fibers caught in the brass corner fitting, fibers that appear to be wool, possibly from a gentleman's suit." Our client leaned forward eagerly. "Yes, Mr. Ashford was dressed in his finest suit, a dark wool outfit that his nephew provided for the occasion." Holmes extracted the fibers carefully and placed them in one of his small envelopes. "The fibers suggest that a body clothed in wool did indeed occupy this space, which raises the question, if the body was here, how was it removed without disturbing the satin lining?" He continued his examination, paying particular attention to the area around the coffin. Suddenly, he stopped and dropped to one knee, his glass focused on a section of the wooden floor. "Watson, observe this." He indicated a barely visible mark on the floorboard. "What do you make of it?" I examined the spot carefully. "It appears to be a scratch or scuff mark, quite fresh by the look of it." "Precisely. And note the direction. It runs from the coffin toward that wall." He followed the mark's trajectory and began examining the wall paneling with renewed intensity. "Mr. Blackwood," he said suddenly, "this wall, what lies beyond it?" "That is the exterior wall of the building. Beyond it is a narrow alley that separates my establishment from the neighboring structure." Holmes continued his examination of the paneling, pressing against various sections and listening carefully to the sounds produced. "Most curious," he muttered. Then, without warning, one section of the paneling swung inward with a soft click. We all gasped in astonishment. Behind the panel lay a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a man to traverse sideways. "A secret passage," I exclaimed. "So it would appear." Holmes produced his pocket lantern and shone its beam into the opening. "The passage extends for several feet and appears to connect with the alley beyond. This would certainly explain how our vanishing corpse made its departure." Mr. Blackwood stared at the opening in horrified fascination. "I had no idea such a thing existed. This building is over 60 years old. The passage must have been constructed for some earlier purpose." "Indeed, perhaps during the building's previous incarnation, it served as a means of discreet entry and exit. But the question remains, who knew of its existence? And why did they choose to remove Mr. Ashford's remains?" Holmes began examining the passage more closely, noting scuff marks on the walls and floor that suggested recent use. "The body was dragged through this passage," he observed. "Note the parallel scrape marks here and here, consistent with someone pulling a heavy object over the floor." As we stood contemplating this remarkable discovery, the chapel door opened with a sharp creak. We turned to see a young man enter, his face flushed with exertion and bearing an expression of considerable agitation. "Uncle Jeremiah!" he called out, then stopped short upon seeing Holmes and myself. "I beg your pardon, I did not realize you had visitors." Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat nervously. "Gentlemen, may I present my nephew, Mr. Edgar Blackwood. Edgar, these are Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, whom I have engaged to investigate the irregularity we discussed." Edgar Blackwood was perhaps 30 years of age, with the same gaunt features as his uncle, but lacking the older man's professional composure. His clothes, while respectable, showed signs of hasty dressing, and there was something furtive in his manner that immediately aroused my suspicions. "Mr. Holmes," Edgar said, extending his hand with what appeared to be forced enthusiasm, "I have heard of your remarkable abilities. I do hope you can resolve this unfortunate matter quickly. My uncle's reputation, indeed our family's livelihood, depends upon it." Holmes accepted the handshake while studying the young man intently. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, what brings you here at this particular moment? That is to say, I often assist my uncle with various aspects of the business. When I heard of this mysterious disappearance, I thought perhaps I might be of service. How very thoughtful of you." Holmes's tone was neutral, but I detected an undercurrent of skepticism. "Were you present when Mr. Ashford's remains were initially received?" "Yes, I helped carry the coffin from the hearse. A sad business, but the old gentleman appeared peaceful enough. "And you noticed nothing unusual about the deceased or the circumstances surrounding his death?" Edgar's eyes darted nervously between his uncle and Holmes. "Nothing beyond the ordinary. Though I must say the nephew, Timothy Ashford, struck me as somewhat eager to have the matter concluded quickly." This was news to me, and apparently to the elder Blackwood as well, judging by his surprised expression. "In what way eager?" Holmes inquired. He seemed anxious about the timing of the funeral, insisting that it take place as soon as possible. When Uncle Jeremiah explained that proper preparation required several days, Mr. Timothy appeared quite agitated. He asked repeatedly about our security arrangements and seemed particularly interested in our evening procedures. Holmes and I exchanged meaningful glances. This information cast Timothy Ashford's behavior in a distinctly suspicious light. "Most illuminating," Holmes observed. "And when did you last see the deceased in his coffin?" "2 evenings ago, when I helped Uncle Jeremiah with the final preparations. Everything appeared normal at that time." "Thank you, Mr. Edgar. Your observations may prove most valuable." Holmes turned back to the elder Blackwood. "I believe we have learned all we can from the scene at present. However, I should very much like to interview the various claimants to Mr. Ashford's estate. Perhaps one of them can shed light on this mystery." As we prepared to depart, Holmes paused at the secret panel, examining its mechanism once more. "One final observation," he said to Mr. Blackwood. "This panel is operated by pressing against a specific point in the carved moulding. The mechanism, while concealed, is not complex. Anyone familiar with the building's construction might discover it through methodical exploration." "Are you suggesting that someone had prior knowledge of the passage?" "I am suggesting that we keep all possibilities open. The disappearance of Mr. Ashford's remains was clearly premeditated and executed with considerable planning. Our task now is to determine who possessed both the motive and the means to carry out such an extraordinary theft." As we emerged into the grey afternoon, I found myself deeply troubled by the morning's revelations. The discovery of the secret passage had provided a mechanism for the body's removal, but it had also raised far more questions than it answered. "Holmes," I said as our hansom cab carried us back toward Baker Street, "what manner of person steals a corpse, and to what possible end?" My companion stared out at the fog-shrouded streets, his aquiline profile sharp against the window. "Those are precisely the questions we must answer, Watson. But consider this. In our experience, the theft of the dead is almost invariably connected with some secret that the deceased carried to the grave. Mr. Cornelius Ashford, it would seem, possessed something of sufficient value to justify the considerable risk involved in removing his remains. But what could a reclusive old man have hidden that would warrant such extreme measures?" "Perhaps something hidden within the body itself," Holmes replied quietly, "or perhaps something that could only be retrieved once the body was removed from public view. Either way, Watson, I suspect we are dealing with individuals of considerable desperation, and desperation, as we have learned, makes people exceedingly dangerous." The fog seemed to thicken as our cab made its way through the darkening streets, and I could not shake the feeling that we were venturing into a mystery that would test even Holmes's remarkable powers of deduction. The disappearance of Cornelius Ashford's body was merely the first movement in what promised to be a most sinister symphony. The following morning brought no relief from the oppressive fog that had settled over London like a malevolent spirit. I awoke to find Holmes already dressed and poring over several documents that had not been present the evening before. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up from his papers, "I trust you slept better than I. I spent the night in correspondence with various sources, gathering intelligence on our mysterious Mr. Cornelius Ashford and his remarkable collection of potential heirs. I poured myself coffee from the pot Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully provided and settled into my chair. What have you discovered?" "Fascinating details, my dear fellow. It appears that our reclusive deceased gentleman was far more complex than Mr. Blackwood's account suggested." Holmes lifted a sheet covered in his precise handwriting. "Mr. Cornelius Ashford was indeed a man of modest means for most of his life. He worked as a clerk for a shipping firm in the city for nearly 40 years. However, approximately 5 years ago, his circumstances changed dramatically." "In what manner?" He came into possession of a considerable sum of money, the exact amount uncertain, but sufficient to allow him to cease working and maintain himself in comfortable retirement. The source of this windfall remains mysterious. Holmes set down the paper and reached for another document. My inquiries through various channels have revealed that each of the 4 claimants to his estate has a history that bears examination. You've been investigating them, naturally. Timothy Ashford, who claims to be the nephew, is indeed related to the deceased. That much is verifiable. However, his own financial circumstances are quite desperate. He owes substantial gambling debts to several unsavory characters in Bermondsey and has been known to frequent the opium dens of Limehouse. I felt a chill of apprehension. A man in such straits might resort to extreme measures. Indeed, Miss Eugenia Pemberton, the alleged illegitimate daughter, presents an equally intriguing profile. She is employed as a governess in Belgravia and has maintained a spotless reputation for over 20 years. However, her employer, Lord Pemberton, recently suffered severe financial reversals, and Miss Pemberton faces the prospect of unemployment without references. And the business associate, Mr. Blackthorne? Holmes's expression grew grimmer. Mr. Rupert Blackthorne operated a small import business that dealt primarily in exotic goods from the Far East. His enterprise failed spectacularly 18 months ago, and he has since been associated with several questionable ventures. There are whispers that he has connections to certain criminal organizations involved in the smuggling trade. And Mrs. Marsh, the supposed common-law wife, perhaps the most intriguing of all. Mrs. Dorothy Marsh is a widow who has been married and widowed no fewer than 3 times. Each of her previous husbands died under circumstances that, while ruled natural by the authorities, left their wives in possession of comfortable inheritances. I set down my coffee cup with a sharp clink. Good heavens, Holmes, are you suggesting? I'm suggesting nothing beyond what the facts indicate. However, Mrs. Marsh's pattern of relationships bears closer examination. A sharp knock at our door interrupted our conversation. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later, her expression suggesting that our visitor was someone of particular importance. Inspector Bradstreet of the Metropolitan Police to see you, Mr. Holmes. The inspector entered with the brisk, no-nonsense manner that had made him one of the Yard's most effective officers. He was a man of medium height and solid build, with greying hair and intelligent eyes that missed little. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, he greeted us with professional courtesy. I understand you have become involved in the matter of the missing corpse in Whitechapel. Indeed, Inspector. Mr. Blackwood engaged our services when he felt that the official investigation had reached an impasse. Bradstreet's expression tightened slightly. I won't pretend that I wasn't skeptical of the Undertaker's account initially. A vanishing body seemed more suited to a sensation novel than a police report. However, subsequent developments have convinced me that we are dealing with a serious criminal matter. Holmes leaned forward with interest. What manner of developments? This morning we received a report that Mr. Ashford's house on Dorset Street had been burgled during the night. The place was thoroughly ransacked, every room searched from floor to ceiling. Curiously, several items of obvious value were left untouched, suggesting that the intruders were searching for something specific. Most illuminating, Holmes observed. Were there any signs of what they might have been seeking? That's the peculiar thing. They seemed particularly interested in the floorboards and walls. Several sections had been pried up or broken through. It was as though they were looking for a hiding place. I found myself thinking of the secret passage at the funeral parlor. Inspector, did the searchers discover anything? If they did, they took it with them. The house has been left in a state of complete destruction. Bradstreet paused and fixed Holmes with a direct stare. Given your reputation for solving seemingly impossible cases, Mr. Holmes, I wondered if you might be willing to share any insights you've gleaned from your investigation. Holmes considered the request carefully. Inspector, I believe we are dealing with individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of both Mr. Ashford's habits and the layout of Mr. Blackwood's funeral establishment. The theft of the body was not a random act of vandalism, but a carefully planned operation designed to achieve a specific objective. Which is? That remains to be determined. However, I suspect that the ransacking of Mr. Ashford's house was connected to the theft of his remains. Perhaps the conspirators discovered that whatever they sought was not with the body and were forced to expand their search. Bradstreet nodded thoughtfully. Your reasoning aligns with my own suspicions. I've arranged to have each of the 4 individuals claiming to be Mr. Ashford's heirs questioned this afternoon. Would you be willing to observe these interviews? Nothing would give me greater pleasure, Holmes replied. Watson and I shall meet you at Scotland Yard at 2 o'clock. After the inspector's departure, Holmes returned to his documents with renewed intensity. The game grows more complex, Watson, he observed. We now have not merely a missing corpse but a burglary that suggests our mysterious thieves did not find what they sought in their initial endeavor. What do you think they were seeking? Something small enough to be concealed within a house, but valuable enough to justify considerable risk. Money, perhaps, or documents of importance, possibly both. At precisely 2 o'clock, we presented ourselves at Scotland Yard, where Inspector Bradstreet had arranged for us to observe the questioning of the 4 claimants from an adjoining room. The first to be brought in was Timothy Ashford, and I was immediately struck by his nervous demeanor. Timothy was a man of perhaps 40 years, with thinning hair and the pallid complexion of one who spent his days in poorly ventilated establishments. His clothes were respectable but showed signs of financial strain, carefully mended tiers and worn cuffs that spoke of genteel poverty. Mr. Ashford, Inspector Bradstreet began, when did you last see your uncle alive? Perhaps a month ago, Inspector. I called upon him to discuss family matters. What manner of family matters? Timothy's hands fidgeted with his hat brim. Uncle Cornelius had been unwell. I was concerned about his welfare and wanted to ensure that he was managing adequately. And was he managing adequately? Oh yes, quite well indeed. Better than I had expected, actually. His house was comfortable, and he seemed to have few financial concerns. Holmes leaned forward slightly, and I could tell that he was paying particular attention to these remarks about the old man's financial state. Did your uncle ever discuss his business affairs with you? Bradstreet continued. Not in detail. He was a private man, Inspector, but he did mention that he had made some fortunate investments that had improved his circumstances considerably. What manner of investments? He was vague about the specifics. Something about shipping ventures and foreign trade, I believe. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes, during which Timothy's nervousness became increasingly apparent. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of the body's disappearance, he claimed to have been at home alone, reading, an alibi that could not be verified. Miss Eugenia Pemberton presented a stark contrast to Timothy Ashford. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, impeccably dressed despite her modest circumstances, and possessed of the composed dignity that comes from years of managing difficult situations. Her posture was erect, her answers precise, and her manner suggested someone accustomed to being scrutinized by her social superiors. Miss Pemberton, Inspector Bradstreet began, you claim to be Mr. Ashford's illegitimate daughter. Upon what do you base this assertion? Upon letters that my mother preserved until her death, Inspector. Mr. Ashford and she maintained a correspondence for several years after my birth. He acknowledged me as his daughter, though he could not, due to his circumstances at the time, provide official recognition. Do you still possess these letters? I do. They are safely kept among my personal papers. When did you last have contact with Mr. Ashford? Miss Pemberton's composed expression flickered slightly. I regret to say that we had no direct contact during his lifetime. My mother made me promise never to approach him while she lived, as she feared it might cause him embarrassment or difficulty. Yet you came forward immediately upon his death. I felt it was my right, indeed my duty, to claim my inheritance as his daughter. I have lived in service all my life, Inspector, and the prospect of a modest independence is not one I could ignore in good conscience. Her alibi for the crucial night was similarly unprovable. She claimed to have been in her rooms at Lord Pembleton's house, preparing lessons for her charges. Mr. Rupert Blackthorne proved to be a man of entirely different character from the previous 2 witnesses. He was large and florid, with the aggressive manner of one accustomed to conducting business through intimidation rather than negotiation. His clothes were expensive but flashy, and his jewelry suggested recent prosperity, despite his alleged business failures. Inspector, he began before Bradstreet could ask his first question. "I want it understood that my claim against Ashford's estate is legitimate and legally sound. The old man owed me £300 from a business venture, and I have documents to prove it." "What manner of business venture?" "Import trade, Inspector. Oriental goods, spices, silks, that sort of thing. Ashford provided capital for several shipments, and when the business encountered difficulties, he was contractually obligated to provide additional funding. He refused, causing substantial losses." "Yet you continued to pursue the debt after your business failed?" Blackthorne's face darkened. "A debt is a debt, Inspector. The fact that my other ventures proved unsuccessful doesn't invalidate Ashford's obligations." When pressed about his whereabouts on the night in question, Blackthorne claimed to have been dining at his club, the Overseas Merchants Association in Cheapside. However, when asked for the names of fellow diners who could corroborate his story, he became evasive. Mrs. Dorothy Marsh was the final interview, and I found her the most unsettling of the four claimants. She was a woman of approximately 60 years, still handsome despite her age, with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes. There was something predatory in her manner that reminded me uncomfortably of certain species of spider. Beautiful, graceful, and utterly deadly. "Mrs. Marsh," Inspector Bradstreet began, "you claim to have been Mr. Ashford's common-law wife. For how long did this relationship exist?" 15 years, Inspector. Cornelius and I met shortly after the death of my previous husband. He was lonely, I was lonely, and we found comfort in each other's companionship." Her voice carried a slight accent that I could not quite place, and her manner suggested a woman of considerable education and sophistication. "Did you cohabitate with Mr. Ashford?" "Not continuously. Cornelius valued his privacy, and I maintained my own residence. However, we spent a considerable amount of time together, and I managed many of his household affairs." "Were you aware of the extent of his financial resources?" Mrs. Marsh's eyes glittered with what might have been amusement. "Cornelius was quite secretive about his business affairs, Inspector. However, I gathered that he had come into some money several years ago, enough to live comfortably without working." "Did he ever discuss the source of this money?" "He mentioned something about a business opportunity that had proven unexpectedly profitable. He was vague about the details, but I sensed that it involved his previous employment with the shipping company." When asked about her whereabouts on the crucial night, Mrs. Marsh claimed to have been visiting a friend in Greenwich, a Mrs. Violet Cromwell, who could presumably verify her presence. After the interviews concluded, Inspector Bradstreet joined Holmes and myself in the observation room. "Well, gentlemen," he said, "what are your impressions?" Holmes had remained silent throughout the questioning, but I could tell from his intense concentration that he was analyzing every word and gesture. "Each of them had both motive and opportunity," he observed. "Timothy Ashford's financial desperation is obvious. Miss Pemberton faces an uncertain future. Blackthorne appears to be a man capable of considerable ruthlessness, and Mrs. Marsh—" He paused thoughtfully. "Mrs. Marsh troubles me most of all." "In what way?" Bradstreet inquired. There was something rehearsed about her responses, as though she had anticipated each question and prepared her answers in advance. Moreover, her story about maintaining a 15-year relationship with a reclusive man while living separately strikes me as implausible. "You suspect her of fabrication?" "I suspect her of being far more involved in Mr. Ashford's affairs than she admits. Watson, did you observe her reaction when asked about the source of Ashford's money?" I considered the question carefully. She seemed pleased, almost as though she possessed knowledge that others lacked. "Precisely. I believe Mrs. Marsh knows exactly how Mr. Ashford acquired his wealth, and I suspect that knowledge may be the key to understanding why his body was stolen." Inspector Bradstreet made notes in his pocketbook. "I'll have my men investigate each of their alibis more thoroughly. In the meantime, is there anything specific you'd recommend?" Holmes rose and began pacing, a sure sign that his mind was working at its highest capacity. "Inspector, I believe our next step must be to examine Mr. Ashford's destroyed house. The burglars were searching for something specific. If we can determine what that was, we may be closer to understanding their ultimate objective." "Very well. I'll arrange for you to have access to the premises tomorrow morning." As we prepared to leave Scotland Yard, Holmes paused and turned back to Bradstreet. "One more thing, Inspector. I should very much like to examine the original death certificate for Mr. Ashford. Who was the attending physician?" Bradstreet consulted his notes. "Dr. Mortimer Hargrave of Whitechapel. He has a practice on Baker's Row, near the London Hospital." "Thank you. I believe a conversation with Dr. Hargrave may prove illuminating." That evening, as we sat before the fire in our Baker Street sitting room, I found myself reflecting on the day's revelations. "Holmes," I said, "I confess myself thoroughly bewildered by this case. We have 4 potential suspects, each with apparent motive, yet no clear indication of which of them might be responsible for the theft." Holmes drew thoughtfully on his pipe, the smoke wreathing around his sharp features. "Watson, I believe we are looking at this matter from the wrong perspective. We have been assuming that one of the 4 claimants orchestrated the theft of the body. But consider this possibility. What if they are all innocent of the primary crime, yet each is pursuing their own agenda related to Mr. Ashford's estate? You mean the real perpetrator might be someone else entirely?" "Exactly. Someone with knowledge of Ashford's true circumstances, someone with the expertise to plan and execute such an elaborate theft, and someone with access to information that none of our 4 claimants possessed. But who could that be?" Holmes's eyes glittered in the firelight. "Consider the facts we have established: the secret passage in the funeral parlor, the precise knowledge of the building's layout, the professional manner in which the body was removed without disturbing the coffin's lining. This suggests someone with intimate knowledge of both the premises and the funeral trade." I felt a chill of understanding. "You suspect someone connected to Blackwood's establishment?" "The possibility cannot be ignored. Tomorrow's examination of Ashford's house may provide the final pieces of this puzzle." The following morning brought yet another fog-shrouded day, and as our hansom carried us through the narrow streets of Spitalfields, I could not shake the feeling that we were drawing closer to a truth that someone was desperate to keep hidden. Ashford's house on Dorset Street proved to be a modest 2-story structure, squeezed between similar dwellings in one of the area's more respectable neighborhoods. The destruction Inspector Bradstreet had described was immediately apparent. The front door hung askew on its hinges, and debris was scattered across the small front garden. The interior revealed the thoroughness of the search. Every room had been systematically destroyed, with floorboards pried up, walls broken through and furniture overturned. Yet, as Bradstreet had noted, several items of obvious value remained untouched: a mantel clock, several pieces of decent silver, and a small collection of books that might have fetched a fair price at any pawnbroker. Holmes began his examination in what had been Ashford's sitting room, paying particular attention to the areas where the searching had been most intensive. "Watson," he called from near the fireplace, "observe this section of wall. The searchers broke through the plaster here, yet they stopped their excavation abruptly. Why might that be?" I examined the damaged wall carefully. Perhaps they found what they were seeking, or perhaps they discovered that what they sought was not here. Holmes knelt and began sifting through the debris on the floor. "Interesting. There are fragments of paper among the rubble, burned paper by the look of it." He collected several pieces and examined them with his magnifying glass. These appear to be the remnants of correspondence, though most is too damaged to read. However, he held up a small fragment. "This piece shows part of a letterhead, Maritime Insurance Comp, and what appears to be a date from 3 years ago. Insurance documents. Possibly, or perhaps shipping manifests. Remember that Ashford worked for a shipping firm, and several of our suspects mentioned his involvement in maritime ventures." Holmes continued his methodical examination, moving from room to room with the patience of a man accustomed to extracting meaning from the smallest details. In what had been Ashford's bedroom, he paused before a section of wall near the window. "This is curious," he murmured, running his hands along the damaged plaster. "The searchers were particularly interested in this area. They've broken through in 3 separate places, yet the wall construction is identical to the rest of the house. What made them focus their attention here?" As he spoke, his fingers encountered something that made him pause. "Watson, bring your medical bag. I require your surgical instruments." Puzzled, I fetched my bag and watched as Holmes used one of my scalpels to carefully extract something from a crack in the wall. "A key," he announced, holding up a small tarnished brass object, hidden with considerable care behind a loose section of mortar. The key was unlike any I had seen before, smaller than a house key but larger than those used for jewelry boxes. It bore intricate engravings and appeared to be of foreign manufacture. "What manner of lock might it open?" I inquired. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must determine. But I suspect this key represents what our mysterious searchers were truly seeking." We spent another hour examining the premises, during which Holmes discovered several additional clues. Traces of candle wax in the cellar that suggested recent nocturnal activity, footprints in the back garden that belonged to at least 3 different individuals, and scratches on the back door lock that indicated skilled manipulation. "The picture grows clearer," Holmes observed as we prepared to leave. "Mr. Ashford's house was visited by our criminals before his death. They were searching for this key, but were unable to locate it. Only after the theft of his body did they return to conduct a more thorough search." "But why steal the body if the key was hidden in the house?" Holmes's expression grew grim. "Perhaps because they initially believed the key was concealed on his person. When that proved incorrect, they were forced to risk returning to the house." As we emerged into the afternoon gloom, I noticed a figure watching us from across the street, a well-dressed woman who seemed vaguely familiar. "Holmes," I murmured, "we're being observed." My companion glanced casually in the indicated direction. "Mrs. Dorothy Marsh," he observed quietly. "Most interesting that she should take such an interest in our investigation." The woman, evidently realizing she had been spotted, began walking briskly away from the scene. "Shall we follow her?" I asked. "No, Watson. Let her believe she has escaped notice. Her presence here tells us more than any conversation might reveal." Our next stop was Dr. Mortimer Hargrave's surgery on Baker's Row. The physician proved to be an elderly gentleman with the weary demeanor of one who had spent decades ministering to the poor of the East End. His surgery was clean but Spartanly furnished, and the man himself bore the hallmarks of someone who had sacrificed personal prosperity for the sake of his calling. "Mr. Ashford," he said when Holmes introduced the purpose of our visit. "Yes, I remember him well. A quiet old gentleman who rarely required medical attention. His death was quite sudden, though not unexpected given his age." "What were the circumstances of his death?" Holmes inquired. "Heart failure brought on by excitement or exertion. I was called to his house by a neighbor who heard cries for help. By the time I arrived, Mr. Ashford was already deceased." "Did you observe anything unusual about the scene or the deceased's condition?" Dr. Hargrave considered the question carefully. "Nothing beyond the ordinary, Mr. Holmes. The old gentleman was found in his sitting room, collapsed in his favorite chair. There were no signs of violence or struggle. Who was present when you arrived?" "The neighbor who summoned me, Mrs. Whitmore from next door, and young Timothy Ashford, who had apparently arrived shortly before my own appearance." Holmes leaned forward with interest. "Timothy Ashford was already present?" "Yes, he claimed to have come for a social visit and found his uncle in distress. He was quite distraught, as one might expect." "Did Mr. Ashford say anything before his death? Did Timothy report any final words?" "According to young Timothy, his uncle's last words were something about the key to everything being safe. I assumed he was referring to his spiritual preparation for death, though Timothy seemed to attach some other significance to the phrase." Holmes and I exchanged meaningful glances. The mysterious key we had discovered suddenly took on even greater importance. After leaving Dr. Hargrave's surgery, we made one final stop, the offices of Pemberton and Associates, the shipping firm where Cornelius Ashford had been employed for 4 decades. The current manager, Mr. James Pemberton, received us in his cluttered office overlooking the Thames. "Cornelius Ashford," he said, shaking his head sadly, "one of our most reliable employees, worked here for nearly 40 years before his retirement." "What were his duties?" Holmes asked. "He was our senior clerk in the Marine Insurance Division, handled all the paperwork for cargo manifests, insurance claims, and settlement documents, knew more about our operations than anyone except myself." "Did he have access to sensitive information?" Mr. Pemberton's expression grew cautious. "Define sensitive, Mr. Holmes." "Information that might be valuable to those engaged in less legitimate enterprises." The manager was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Mr. Holmes, The shipping trade is complex, and not all cargo that passes through London's docks is entirely above board. Cornelius handled documentation for legitimate merchants, but he was also aware of certain irregularities that we chose not to investigate too closely. What manner of irregularities? Cargo manifests that didn't quite match the actual contents of certain shipments. Insurance claims for goods that may not have been lost in the manner reported. That sort of thing. Holmes nodded grimly. And Mr. Ashford's sudden prosperity 5 years ago, might that have been connected to his knowledge of these irregularities? Pemberton's silence was answer enough. As we returned to Baker Street that evening, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a coherent picture in my mind, though the complete solution remained tantalizingly out of reach. "Holmes," I said as we settled before our fire, "I believe I begin to understand the general shape of this mystery, though many details remain unclear." "Excellent, Watson. Share your reasoning." Cornelius Ashford discovered something during his employment at the shipping firm, information that he was able to use to secure payment for his silence. The mysterious key we found likely opened something containing evidence of this criminal activity. When Ashford died, the criminals realized they needed to recover both the evidence and any records of their arrangement with him. Holmes smiled approvingly. "Very good. And the theft of the body. They initially believed the key was concealed on his person. When they discovered their error, they were forced to search his house, hence the burglary." "Precisely. But Watson, consider this. Who would have known about Ashford's arrangement with these criminals? Who would have understood the significance of his final words about the key to everything? The implications struck me like a physical blow. Timothy Ashford. He was present when his uncle died, he heard the crucial words, and he would have known about his uncle's connection to the shipping firm. Indeed. But Timothy's desperate financial circumstances make him an unlikely candidate for the sophisticated planning we have observed. No, Watson, I believe Timothy Ashford is being manipulated by someone with far greater resources and cunning." As if summoned by our conversation, Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "there's a young gentleman downstairs who insists on speaking with you urgently. He says it concerns the missing body case and that lives may be in danger." Holmes rose immediately. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson." The young man who entered our sitting room was Edgar Blackwood, the Undertaker's nephew, and his appearance was dramatically different from our previous encounter. His clothes were disheveled, his face was pale with fear, and his hands trembled visibly as he struggled to compose himself. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "I must tell you the truth. I fear I may have been an unwitting accomplice to murder." Edgar Blackwood's confession struck the room like a thunderbolt. Holmes gestured for him to take a seat, his keen eyes never leaving the young man's anguished face. "Compose yourself, Mr. Blackwood," Holmes said with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Begin at the beginning and tell us everything." Edgar accepted the offered brandy with shaking hands and took a steadying sip before speaking. "Mr. Holmes, 3 weeks ago I was approached by a woman, Mrs. Dorothy Marsh. She claimed to be planning a surprise for Mr. Ashford and needed to know details about our security arrangements and the layout of our premises." My blood ran cold at this revelation. Mrs. Marsh, the woman we had observed watching Ashford's house. "What manner of surprise?" Holmes inquired, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "She said she wanted to hold a private vigil for Mr. Ashford before the public funeral. She claimed it was an old custom from her family, and that she needed to ensure she could access the chapel during evening hours without disturbing anyone." Holmes leaned forward intently. "And you provided her with this information?" Edgar's face flushed with shame. "She was most persuasive, Mr. Holmes. She spoke of her deep affection for the old gentleman and how important this private farewell was to her. She even offered to pay me a considerable sum, £20, for my assistance." £20 is indeed a substantial amount for someone in your circumstances, Holmes observed without judgment. "What specific information did you provide?" "I told her about the evening schedules, when Uncle Jeremiah typically locked the premises, and—" Edgar's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I showed her the secret passage. You were aware of its existence? I discovered it years ago when I was helping with renovations. The panel mechanism became loose, and I found the passage by accident. I mentioned it to Uncle Jeremiah, but he said it was probably used for smuggling in the building's previous incarnation, and that we should simply ignore it. Holmes nodded grimly. Continue with your account. Mrs. Marsh seemed fascinated by the passage. She examined it thoroughly and asked numerous questions about how it functioned. She said it would be perfect for her purposes. She could conduct her vigil without anyone knowing she was there. And you suspected nothing sinister about this request? Edgar's anguish was palpable. Mr. Holmes, I was desperate for the money. My gambling debts had reached a critical point, and I was facing threats from my creditors. Mrs. Marsh seemed like a respectable lady, and her request, while unusual, appeared harmless enough. When did you realize that something was amiss? Yesterday morning, when Uncle Jeremiah discovered the body was missing. I knew immediately that Mrs. Marsh must have been involved, but I was terrified to admit my role in the matter. I hoped that perhaps she had simply moved the body for her vigil and would return it. Holmes rose and began pacing before the fireplace. Mr. Blackwood, your confession, while late in coming, may have prevented a grave injustice. However, I fear the matter is far more serious than you realize. In what way, Mr. Holmes? I have reason to believe that Mrs. Marsh is not merely a woman seeking to conduct an unusual vigil. She is part of a criminal conspiracy that extends far beyond the theft of your uncle's remains. Edgar's face went ashen. Criminal conspiracy. But she seemed so respectable, so concerned about Mr. Ashford's welfare. The most dangerous criminals often wear the mask of respectability, Holmes observed. Tell me, did Mrs. Marsh ever mention any associates or indicate that others were involved in her plans? She mentioned having a carriage waiting in the alley behind our building. She said her driver would help her with the ceremonial arrangements. Did you see this driver? Briefly. A large man with dark hair and a scar on his left cheek. He remained with the carriage while Mrs. Marsh and I discussed the details of her visit. Holmes stopped pacing abruptly. Watson, that description matches the man we observed loitering near Ashford's house yesterday afternoon. The implications were becoming clearer by the moment. Mrs. Marsh had orchestrated not only the theft of the body, but also the subsequent search of Ashford's residence. She was clearly the mastermind behind the entire operation. Mr. Blackwood, Holmes continued, I need you to think carefully. Did Mrs. Marsh ask any questions about Mr. Ashford himself? His habits, his possessions, his relationships? Edgar nodded slowly. She seemed particularly interested in his business affairs. She asked if he had ever mentioned having valuable documents, or if he had expressed concern about his safety. She also inquired about visitors to the funeral parlor, whether anyone else had come to pay their respects. And your responses? I told her that Mr. Ashford had seemed worried about something in recent weeks. Timothy had mentioned that his uncle had been acting strangely, checking his locks frequently and seeming nervous about unexpected callers. Holmes's expression grew increasingly grave. Mr. Blackwood, I believe you have been manipulated by individuals involved in a conspiracy that may include murder. Murder? Edgar's voice was barely audible. Consider the facts, Mr. Ashford dies suddenly, just as he has become increasingly concerned about his safety. His body is stolen using information you provided to Mrs. Marsh. His house is subsequently ransacked by professional criminals. The pattern suggests that Mr. Ashford possessed something that made him dangerous to certain individuals. I found myself thinking of the key we had discovered and the evidence of Ashford's involvement with maritime insurance irregularities. Holmes, I interjected, if Mrs. Marsh is indeed the mastermind, she must have been working with accomplices who had access to detailed information about Ashford's activities. Precisely, Watson. And I believe I know who at least one of those accomplices must be. Holmes turned to Edgar with renewed intensity. Mr. Blackwood, when Mrs. Marsh first approached you, how did she know to contact you specifically? Why not approach your uncle directly or make her request through normal channels? Edgar considered the question carefully. She said that Timothy Ashford had recommended me as someone who might be sympathetic to her needs and discreet about the arrangement. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with an almost audible click. Timothy Ashford, Holmes said quietly, the nephew who was present at his uncle's death, who heard the crucial final words about the key to everything, and who was desperately in need of money to pay gambling debts. But surely, I protested, Timothy's grief at his uncle's death was genuine. His distress during the police interview seemed real enough. I don't doubt that Timothy's grief was sincere, Watson, but consider this scenario. Timothy was indeed visiting his uncle, perhaps to request financial assistance. During their conversation, Ashford became agitated, possibly because he suspected Timothy of betraying information about his circumstances to dangerous individuals. The shock and stress brought on the fatal heart attack. Holmes continued his reasoning aloud, each deduction building upon the last. Timothy, realizing that his uncle's last words referenced something of tremendous importance, contacted Mrs. Marsh, who I suspect had already been pressuring him for information about his uncle's habits and possessions. Together, they planned to recover whatever evidence Ashford had been hiding. "But why steal the entire body?" Edgar asked. "Because they initially believed the key was concealed on Ashford's person, sewn into his clothing or hidden in his personal effects. Only when they discovered their error were they forced to risk the much more dangerous undertaking of searching his house." A sharp knock at our door interrupted Holmes's exposition. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a telegram, which Holmes read with growing concern. "Inspector Bradstreet," he announced. "Mrs. Marsh has disappeared from her lodgings, and Timothy Ashford has not been seen since yesterday evening. The inspector requests our immediate assistance." Holmes turned to Edgar with decision. "Mr. Blackwood, you must accompany us to Scotland Yard immediately. Your testimony will be crucial in securing justice for your uncle's unwitting role in this affair." Within the hour, we were assembled in Inspector Bradstreet's office, where the full scope of the conspiracy was finally revealed. Holmes presented the key we had discovered, along with his deductions about its significance. "Inspector," Holmes explained, "I believe this key opens a safe deposit box or similar repository where Cornelius Ashford stored evidence of criminal activities involving maritime insurance fraud. The criminals who killed him sought to recover this evidence to protect themselves from prosecution." Bradstreet examined the key carefully. It appears to be of continental manufacture, possibly German or Belgian. There are several private banking establishments in London that use similar security devices. My suggestion would be to begin with institutions that cater to clients involved in international shipping. Ashford would have chosen a location convenient to his work, but discreet enough to avoid unwanted attention. As we spoke, a constable entered with news that sent a chill through the room. "Inspector, we found Timothy Ashford's body in the Thames near Wapping Old Stairs. He appears to have been murdered, struck on the head before entering the water." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Mrs. Marsh had eliminated her accomplice, either because he had become a liability or because he had attempted to claim a larger share of whatever treasure they had been seeking. "How long has he been in the water?" Holmes inquired. "The divisional surgeon estimates 12 to 18 hours, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned to Inspector Bradstreet with urgency. "Inspector, Mrs. Marsh is clearly eliminating anyone who can connect her to these crimes. If she has recovered Ashford's evidence, she may attempt to flee London entirely." "What do you recommend?" "We must locate the repository opened by Ashford's key before Mrs. Marsh can access it herself. If she hasn't found it yet, it may be our only chance to gather evidence against her." The next several hours were a blur of activity as we visited one private banking establishment after another. Holmes's deduction about institutions serving the shipping trade proved accurate. The key opened a safe deposit box at Hartwell and Associates, a discreet banking house near the London docks that catered primarily to maritime merchants. The contents of the box were extraordinary. Detailed records of insurance fraud involving dozens of cargo shipments, correspondence with criminal organizations operating throughout Europe, and most damning of all, evidence that Mrs. Dorothy Marsh was not a grieving widow, but the leader of an international syndicate specializing in maritime crime. "Look at this," Holmes said, holding up a photograph. "Mrs. Marsh meeting with known associates of the Hamburg shipping cartels. And here," he displayed a document written in German. "Financial records showing payments to her of over £50,000 in the past 3 years. Inspector Bradstreet whistled softly. £50,000. No wonder she was willing to kill to protect her secrets. The documents revealed that Cornelius Ashford had stumbled upon the conspiracy during his routine work processing insurance claims. Rather than reporting it immediately, he had chosen to blackmail Mrs. Marsh for a modest pension, £500 per year in exchange for his silence. The old gentleman was playing a dangerous game, Holmes observed. He must have realized eventually that his knowledge made him a liability rather than an asset to Mrs. Marsh. But why kill him now? I asked. If the arrangement had been working for several years, what changed? Holmes studied the documents more carefully before answering. Here's our answer, Watson. This letter, dated just 2 weeks before Ashford's death, indicates that the authorities in Hamburg had begun investigating the syndicate's operations. Mrs. Marsh knew that Ashford's evidence could destroy her if it fell into official hands, so she decided to eliminate him and recover the evidence. Precisely, but Ashford had grown suspicious of her intentions and hid the key where she couldn't find it, hence the elaborate scheme to steal his body and search his house. Inspector Bradstreet was already organizing the manhunt for Mrs. Marsh, dispatching constables to watch the railway stations, ports and coaching stops throughout London. However, Holmes seemed convinced that our quarry would not flee immediately. She still doesn't know where Ashford hid the evidence, he pointed out. She may attempt one final search before abandoning her efforts. His prediction proved accurate. That very evening, as we maintained surveillance on Blackwood's funeral establishment, we observed a figure moving stealthily through the alley behind the building. Mrs. Marsh, accompanied by her scarred associate, had returned to the scene of her crime, presumably hoping to discover some clue that would lead her to Ashford's hiding place. "She doesn't yet know that we've found the evidence," Holmes whispered as we watched from our concealment. "This may be our opportunity to apprehend her." Inspector Bradstreet had positioned constables at strategic points around the building, and as Mrs. Marsh entered through the secret passage, we moved to surround the premises. The confrontation, when it came, was swift but dramatic. Mrs. Marsh had broken into the chapel and was systematically destroying the interior fittings in a desperate search for hidden compartments. When the constables burst through the doors, she produced a small revolver and attempted to fight her way to freedom. "It's no use, Mrs. Marsh," Holmes called out calmly. "We have recovered Cornelius Ashford's evidence. Your criminal enterprise is finished." For a moment, the elegant mask slipped completely, and I saw the true face of Dorothy Marsh, cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. Then, perhaps realizing the futility of resistance, she lowered her weapon and allowed herself to be taken into custody. The trial of Dorothy Marsh and her associates became one of the most sensational criminal cases of the decade. The evidence recovered from Ashford's safe deposit box revealed a conspiracy that extended across Europe and involved millions of pounds in fraudulent insurance claims. Mrs. Marsh, whose real name was revealed to be Greta Zimmerman, was condemned to hang for the murders of Cornelius Ashford and Timothy Ashford. Her scarred associate, Heinrich Müller, received a sentence of life imprisonment, while several other members of the syndicate were arrested by authorities in Germany and Belgium. Edgar Blackwood, despite his unwitting involvement in the conspiracy, was treated leniently by the courts. His genuine remorse and cooperation with the investigation earned him a suspended sentence and a chance to begin his life anew. The other 3 claimants to Ashford's estate, Miss Pemberton, Mr. Blackthorne, and the unfortunate Timothy, were all eventually cleared of involvement in the crimes, though their various deceptions and fabrications had complicated the investigation considerably. As for Jeremiah Blackwood, the Undertaker's reputation was restored, and his establishment continued to serve the community with distinction. He installed new security measures and sealed the secret passage permanently, vowing never again to allow his premises to be used for such sinister purposes. On a fog-bound evening, some weeks after the conclusion of the case, Holmes and I sat before our fire in Baker Street, reflecting on the extraordinary events that had begun with a simple report of a missing corpse. "It's remarkable," I observed, "how a single moment of greed, Edgar Blackwood's acceptance of Mrs. Marsh's £20, nearly allowed a murderer to escape justice entirely." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Yet it was that same greed that ultimately led to her downfall, Watson. Had Mrs. Marsh been content with the evidence she already possessed, she might have disappeared without a trace. Her determination to recover Ashford's documents provided us with the opportunity we needed." "What do you think became of the original body? almost certainly destroyed to eliminate evidence of the theft, Mrs. Marsh was nothing if not thorough in her criminal methodology. I found myself thinking of poor Cornelius Ashford, whose quiet retirement had been shattered by his discovery of the conspiracy, and whose death had set in motion the chain of events that exposed one of the most elaborate criminal enterprises we had ever encountered. "Holmes," I said, "do you think Ashford realized the danger he was in?" "I believe he suspected it, which is why he took such care to hide the evidence where Mrs. Marsh couldn't find it." In his way, the old gentleman struck the final blow against his killers. Even death could not prevent him from bringing them to justice. The fog outside our windows began to lift as the night wore on, and I reflected that our investigation had similarly cleared away the obscuring mists of deception that had surrounded this most unusual case. Once again, Holmes's remarkable powers of deduction had triumphed over even the most carefully planned criminal conspiracy. The Undertaker's secret, as the newspapers would later call it, had been revealed at last. Not a secret of the grave, but a secret of greed, betrayal, and the terrible price of dealing with those who prey upon the innocent. Justice, like the fog that morning, had finally lifted to reveal the truth beneath.